On the morning of June 3rd, 1887, Sage Hollow woke under a hard sky already 91 degrees by 9 o'clock, with dust moving in long, pale sheets across the wagon ruts and the cottonwood draw running narrower than old men remembered for that early in summer. The settlement counted 312 souls by the church ledger, and nearly all of them depended on one channel of water, two shallow wells, and luck they called Providence when it held. By noon, the smithy trough had gone warm as broth. By evening, 3 households had sent children with buckets twice the usual distance for half the usual fill. Nothing had failed outright yet, but every practical mind in town could feel the arithmetic closing in. Cole Porter crossed Main Street in that heat with Daniel Porter's work gloves tucked through her belt loop, fingers of the leather darkened by old oil and sun, and no one stopped her long. Some nodded with the stiff courtesy reserved for fresh grief. Others looked away because she carried not only widowhood, but prediction, and prediction had become unwelcome commerce in Sage Hollow. Each dawn she stood on her porch with a ruled ledger and marked rainfall, wind direction, cloud ceiling, and draw depth in inches measured against a stake she had driven herself. Children called her Rainbook Cole when they were close enough to tease and far enough to run. Their mothers hushed them. Their fathers did not. Daniel had died in October of the previous year, 3 days after the South Communal well turned brackish and a fever passed through 7 homes in less than a week. He had hauled for 2 families before his own pulse went thin, then gone still before dawn on the 4th day, age 34, with a team unpaid and winter wood only half stacked. There had been no sermon long enough to explain the waste of that fact. The town buried him on a rise above the draw with 6 inches of early frost in the topsoil and a wind that kept blowing dirt back into the grave as if the ground itself resisted duty. After the burial, Cole took up the tasks he had left unfinished and added one none of his neighbors thought sensible. The knowledge she used had not started with her, nor even with Daniel. It had come through Daniel's mother, Miriam Porter, who had crossed west from Tennessee hill country with 2 trunks, 1 milk cow, and habits learned where summer creeks vanished by August and springs survived only if protected before scarcity made men desperate. She had taught by demonstration, not lecture. Watch grasses first, because roots report what surface cannot. Watch insects next, because colonies move before larger beasts admit danger. Test stone last, because rock tells the truth without pity, but never in haste. She had shown Cole how cottonwood roots bent toward hidden seep, how alkaline crust formed in rings where evaporation outran recharge, how frost heave mapped subsurface fracture if one cared to kneel and look instead of riding past. When Miriam died, she left no money, no silver, and no tract deed, only a wrapped packet of notes and 1 sentence repeated often enough to become instruction. Thirst is late news. Cole wore that sentence like a second spine. She was 29, broad-shouldered from lifting feed sacks and cutting ties, with windburn along the cheekbones and palms mapped by callus, old burns, and fresh splits. She was not a woman given to speeches. She paid debts on time when weather allowed and carried silence the way others carried rifles, visible but seldom raised. Her claim lay on 40 acres north of town, where the soil ran alkali lean over caliche, and the prevailing opinion said only stubborn grass and thin oats would hold. That opinion had made the land affordable. Daniel had bought it for $1.25 per acre in 1884, signing with a hand steady enough to suggest hope and caution in equal measure. Hope had thinned since then. Caution had not. By the 2nd week of June, Cole had surveyed her bench in a grid marked by stakes at 20-foot intervals and twine lines drawn true with a plumb stone Daniel had turned on his lathe years earlier. She tested 6 points with an iron bar and a post auger borrowed from the Langfords, each bore logged by depth, resistance, and moisture trace. At 11 feet near the old cottonwood stump, she found powder dry crumble. At 13 feet near the east rise, she struck dense caliche that rang under steel. At 10 feet near the basalt outcrop, she found cooler subsoil and a faint sour smell of damp mineral. That point she marked with red chalk and a square of cloth tied to a stake. Neighbors passing on the road watched her pace, kneel, mark, and move again. They called it widow fussing. She called it choosing where failure would cost least. The shovel that became her emblem had broken at the blade edge in late spring while she was trenching for beans. A blacksmith could have replaced it for $2.40, but $2.40 also bought flour, lamp oil, and 1 sack of beans. She cut a strap from a cracked wagon tire, heated it at her own cook stove, and riveted it across the missing edge with 4 square nails, flattened into heads by hammering on an anvil block. It was an ugly repair, but it held shape and took bite. She sharpened it every 3rd evening with a bastard file and quench water saved from dish basins. When the edge curled, she hammered it back. When the handle split, she wrapped it with rawhide and let it dry tight. The shaft began at 4 feet across and narrowed to 3 by intention, because she planned cribbing from the first day and knew timber was dear. Pine planks came from a dismantled freight crate lot behind the depot, bought for $12 cash and hauled home in 2 trips with cedar. Her bay mare with a white star and a temper more patient than most men in town. Cole cut each board to 6-foot lengths, brushed them with boiled linseed and ash to resist rot, and stacked them under canvas. Lime for ceiling seams cost 90 cents a sack when available, $1.20 when not. Clay she took from a bank east of her claim where winter runoff had exposed clean blue layers. She mixed lime and clay in a ratio Miriam had used for root cellars, 2 buckets to 1, adding water until it held to a trowel upside down for 3 breaths. In dry heat, cure time ran fast. In shade, it held longer. The labor moved by inches. Dawn digging until the sun broke hard over the ridge. Midday hauling spoil by bucket and rope. Late afternoon trimming the shaft walls, setting temporary braces and checking plumb with a weighted string. At 12 feet she began cribbing, dropping plank frames and wedging corners with oak shims cut from old fence rails. At 14 she hit a caliche shelf that turned each shovel strike into a jolt up both arms. At 15 she changed rhythm and used a hand pick first. 3 strikes to fracture, 1 scoop to clear. The work measured itself in blistered palms, frayed rope fibers, and the sound of steel on stone. Men from town stopped often enough to form an audience. Some offered advice they had never tested. Some offered laughter free of charge. Asa Kincaid, who owned the general store and kept half the town in credit through winter, rode out one Saturday in a clean vest despite the dust and watched her hoist 2 spoil buckets before speaking. He was a broad man in his 40s, trimmed beard, polished boots, hatband of stitched leather bought in Cheyenne. All the visible signs of prosperity in a place where prosperity often announced itself by remaining clean. "You are burying money where water does not live," he said, loud enough for the 2 ranch hands behind him. Licensed drillers failed near this bench in '79. A patch shovel does not improve on licensed work. Cole set down the rope, wiped grit from her wrist with the back of her hand, and returned to the shaft collar without argument. Kincaid laughed once, short and pleased, then named the whole Porter's grave before turning his horse toward town. The ranch hands carried the joke back with them, but in June it stayed mostly on porches and in passing remarks, mean without yet becoming official. She kept digging. Cedar stood in the scant shade of the supply shed and flicked flies with her tail while the bucket line creaked over the pulley block. When the road voices thinned and only wind moved through the bunch grass, Cole rested one forearm on the shovel handle and spoke to the mare in a tone low enough to belong to work rather than declaration. "Let them spend their breath on names," she said. "I must spend mine on depth." By late July, Cottonwood Draw had dropped another visible inch against Cole's stake. The south communal well was pulling slower at dawn, and the north well began tasting of iron by afternoon. That was when Kincaid's phrase turned from private jab to town label. By Monday, children had scratched Porter's grave in chalk on a fence post near her gate. By late July, the shaft had reached 12 feet. Cribbing sat true, and the first real test had not yet come. The test came 2 mornings later, on July 29th, when dawn broke at 78 degrees, and the wind arrived hot enough to carry the smell of alkali before the sun reached the church bell. Cole was in the shaft by first light, boots braced against cribbing, cutting at a pale seam of caliche with the handpick, when Cedar stamped twice and blew through her nostrils toward the road. By the time Cole climbed out, palms white with lime dust, a line had formed at the north communal well. 12 households, 23 buckets, 4 barrels, and 1 argument already rising between 2 ranch wives over whose children had gone without supper water the night before. At 6 o'clock, the bucket hit bottom with a wet thud, not a splash. At 6:10, it came up half full of gray mud. By 8 o'clock, Asa Kincaid stood on the plank walk outside his store and announced new rope prices in a voice trained by commerce and committee meetings. 3/8 inch hemp, which had sold for 9 cents per foot in May, now stood at 27 cents. Iron bucket hooks doubled from 15 to 30 cents each. Tin dipper sets, $1.40. Kincaid called it freight scarcity and replacement risk. The town called it what men called any measure they disliked and still paid. A freight team had come in short from Laramie at dusk the previous day. 1 wagon axle split. 2 mules dead 15 miles east, and the driver too worn to climb down without help. Water barrels on that team were half what had been ordered. Flour arrived. Pump parts did not. Hope and Sage Hollow had begun to take inventory by weight. Cole listened without pausing her work. She had not built her life around announcements from a porch. Daniel had taught her accounts. Miriam had taught her sequence. Labor first, tally second, complaint never. She crossed her yard in 14 measured strides, took a charcoal nub from her apron pocket, and marked the day's figures on a board she had nailed to the shed wall. Shaft depth, 12 feet 7 inches. Spoil hauled 8 cubic feet. Plank stock, 23 lengths. Lime remaining 2 sacks and a quarter. Cash in tin box, $14.61. Owed to Kincaid, $8 on winter flour, due after harvest. Owed nowhere else. At mid-morning, Nell Harrow came with a slate under one arm and a pail in the other, sent by her mother for trade. Nell was 13, narrow-faced, observant, and habitually silent around adults who had not earned her words. She stood near the gate until Cole nodded permission, then set down the pail and pointed with her slate pencil at the shaft collar, where fresh cracks had opened in the upper ring of dry soil after 3 days of heat and vibration. "That edge will slough if the wind keeps from the south," Nell said. "Schoolhouse well did that in March." Cole gave her a plank offcut and a handful of peach pits saved for feed mash, fair exchange for warning and for the pail of clean clay Nell had carried from the Harrow Creek bank at dawn. She knelt by the collar and showed the girl how to cut relief notches with a hatchet so a brace could seat flush against unstable ground. 2 cuts angled inward, 1 cross tap, lift out the wedge, set the brace. Hammer only until the wood sang, never until it split. "Your hand wants force," Cole said, passing the hatchet back. "Give it placement instead." Nell nodded once, as if filing the phrase with lessons she trusted more than arithmetic, then walked home along the ditch track, slate tucked against her ribs like a shield. The afternoon widened into hard light. Cole rigged a second pulley above the shaft using an old wagon hub set between forked posts, sunk 30 inches and tamped with wet clay. The arrangement was slower than a bought windlass but required no cast gearing, only balance and rope discipline. She tied a bow line around each bucket handle, then a stopper knot 2 hands above to keep the line from running through gloved fingers when descent went fast. With the double line, she could lower and empty while raising a full, saving 12 to 15 motions each hour. At the rate she maintained, 1 cubic foot of compacted caliche took nearly 20 minutes to break, scoop, lift, and spread. That translated to inches, not feet, but inches accumulated where boasting did not. By July 31st, the shaft stood at 13 feet 4 inches. The cribbing at the lower ring had begun to take side pressure, visible in hairline bends at 2 plank corners. Cole chose reinforcement over speed. She rode cedar to the rail spur and bought discarded iron hoops from a Cooper's reject pile, $12 for 9 pieces. Each cracked at 1 rivet but sound along most of its curve. Back home, she heated sections in a trench fire, hammered them flatter, drilled fresh holes with a hand brace, and bolted pairs together into collars just under 3 feet in diameter. Set against the inner crib and cinched with threaded rod she had salvaged from Daniel's broken cedar. Each collar held the planks true against creep. She logged every installation date in her ledger. Wood remembered stress. Iron remembered neglect. On the first day of August, heat pushed past 100 by noon and held there until near dark. 3 miles south, cottonwood draw thinned to a braided trickle with exposed stones where boys had fished in spring. Jackrabbits that usually fed in open sage at dusk were already moving upslope before sunrise, slipping through greasewood shadows toward cooler benches. Ant mounds along the north road had risen into narrow towers overnight, each entrance collar built higher than usual by an inch or more, a sign Miriam had once called Small Creatures Building, for weathermen had not yet felt. Cole marked all of it: rabbit movement, ant towers, wind shift east by north, cloudless dome, evening humidity near nothing. She did not call this prophecy. She called it reading what was present. At church social that Sunday, Asa Kincaid carried his mockery further because his audience had narrowed to those still comfortable. He stood near the lemonade table in a linen shirt that had not seen ditch mud in years, and told a knot of ranch hands and 2 councilmen that Cole Porter had become our widow surveyor of insects, then lifted his cup toward the women arranging hymn books. She will soon claim the ants hold county office and vote for drought, he said. Porter's grave has become widow weather sermons, and sermons do not fill barrels. Laughter followed in the careful way of souls who wish to belong to power without appearing cruel. Cole, who had come only to leave a sack of onions for the supper pot, set the onions on the kitchen table and departed before anyone could offer her a seat chosen from pity. That evening she walked the shaft with a lamp and checked each seam by touch. Clay lime seal held cool and firm against her fingers except at one joint where shrinkage had opened a nail-width crack. She packed it, smoothed it, and moved on. Cedar stood tied to the hitch rail, head low, listening to the regular strike of Cole's hammer, as if listening to weather itself. The town had reduced her work to a nickname. The work did not answer to names. 2 days later, the county courier arrived with a note that the promised hand pump assembly had missed loading in Cheyenne and would come on the next rail, date uncertain. By then, the council had already voted 5-2 to spend $38 on a decorative cistern wall in the churchyard, cut stone with a carved lip, because visible order reassured donors from outside the valley. Reinforcement of the north and south communal wells was postponed pending better conditions. Cole heard the vote read aloud outside the store while buying lamp oil. She paid 50 cents, accepted no credit, and walked home in silence. She began widening a previously narrowed intersection from 3 feet to 3.5 to allow easier lowering of crib frames at deeper levels, while keeping the original 4-foot mouth unchanged, then narrowed again below 10 feet to preserve lateral strength. The geometry mattered. A broad throat invited collapse under desiccated soil, while a narrow working chamber saved timber and held temperature steadier. She cut new braces from cottonwood saplings, stripped and dried under canvas, each brace fitted with opposing wedges so tension could be adjusted from above, using a hooked pole rather than a descent into unstable sections. At 14 feet, she laid the first iron collar. At 14 feet 9 inches, she laid the second. She worked by lantern after sunset when wind dropped and sound carried from town. A piano in the boarding house, one drunk argument outside the saloon, then stillness. By August 5th, after 37 consecutive dry days, she reached 15 feet 1 inch and struck a harder lens of caliche peppered with gravel that dulled the shovel edge every hour. She climbed out, set the broken shovel across 2 sawhorses, and reset the wagon tire strap with fresh rivets cut from fencing wire and peened flat on the anvil block. Cost of the repair was 4 nails, 1 handspan of wire, and 40 minutes she could not spare. She spent them anyway. Tools that failed deep became accidents. Accidents consumed more than time. Near dusk, Asa Kincaid rode by again, slower this time, hat brim lower against the glare. He reined in at her gate, looked over the braces, the collar iron, the spoil mound sorted by layer, and the ledger board dense with figures. "You are making a profession of digging your own hardship," he said, not as loudly as before. "Even if water exists down there, one woman cannot defend it when need comes." Cole stood with one boot on the shovel step, breathing dust, face streaked with clay. She did not offer him shade and did not ask him to leave. "One woman cannot defend waste either," she said. "Yet we have tried that method for years." Kincaid held her gaze for a span, then touched his heel to his horse and went back toward town, where shelves were still stocked enough to hide fear for another week. The next morning came hotter, and the line at the communal well formed before sunrise. Cole lowered herself into the shaft on a rope seat Daniel had once braided for orchard pruning, set her boots against the crib at 15 feet, and drove the patched blade into stone 1 measured bite at a time. The patched blade rang and scraped, and the rhythm steadied the morning more surely than the church bell ever had. At 15 feet, the shaft held a trapped coolness that did not belong to August, and Cole worked from that cool pocket upward, breaking lens after lens of caliche into fragments no larger than a thumb joint, so they could be hoisted without overloading the rope. Every third bucket she paused to test the cribbing with a short mallet, listening for hollow notes that signaled drift. Solid wood returned a tight knock. Trouble returned a dull answer. She trusted sound because sound traveled where sight could not. By noon, she had lifted 17 buckets and gained 3 inches. She climbed out, drank exactly 1 dipper, and set to reinforcing the upper collar where dryness was opening hairline separations in the clay seam. She mixed 1 fresh batch at 2 buckets clay to 1 bucket lime, then added ash from her stove until the paste thickened enough to hold against vertical plank without sag. 2 ranch hands passed on the road and watched her work from their saddles. When one offered to sell her a used windlass at $4, she asked to see the pawl teeth first. They rode on when they understood she would not buy blind. By sundown, she had cut 2 replacement wedges, reset the lowest iron ring, and marked the board. Depth 15 feet 4 inches, spoil 9 cubic feet, rope wear moderate at 42 feet from bitter end. By the second week of August, she had shifted from simple downward digging to a repeatable cycle that turned one worker into a crew of methods. Dawn was excavation. Late morning was hauling and sorting spoil by layer, pale powder for road fill, coarse gravel for drainage, heavier fragments for basin footing she intended to build if water ever rose. Afternoon was structure, fitting pine crib frames cut in 6-foot lengths, lowering them by guide rope, and seating them with opposing taps so each frame bore load evenly. Night was repair. She filed shovel edge, greased pulley axle with tallow, inspected knots under lantern light, and entered figures in the ledger with hands that trembled only after the work was done. Money narrowed with the season. At the rail spur, she found another lot of damaged Cooper hoops and paid $9 for 8 pieces, $3 less than the first purchase because 2 were bent beyond easy use. She heated and trued each strip over a trench fire, then drilled bolt holes with a brace bit Daniel had sharpened so many times the shank had worn nearly smooth. Cedar hauled water for tempering and dragged spoil farther from the collar, so surface weight would not stress the shaft rim. Cole added a plank platform around the mouth, 8 feet square, to distribute load and keep curious feet away from the edge. She did not call it safety. She called it staying alive long enough to finish. At 16 feet 9 inches, she struck a harder band that sparked against iron. At 17 feet 2 inches, she changed tools, pick for fracture and shovel for lift. At 18 feet, the walls began to sweat faintly at dawn and dry by noon, a small sign, not yet promise. She lined one section with doubled plank where a vertical crack had appeared in native soil, then cinched it with the 3rd iron collar. Her palms split along old callus ridges. She wrapped them in clean cloth at night, unwrapped before first light, and took up the handle again. Nothing in town moved with that constancy. Not freight, not policy, not opinion. Opinion, however, grew louder. Asa Kincaid's phrase became common speech by harvest's edge, and Porter's grave traveled from porches into meetings where decisions were made. At church committee, when names were read for winter aid visits, Cole's was passed over with no explanation offered aloud. At the schoolyard fence, older boys repeated Kincaid's line to younger children until it sounded like lesson rather than cruelty. 2 hired men she had asked for 1 day of timber setting refused at her gate, saying they could not afford to be seen digging into a widow's folly when ranch foremen were listening. She paid them no reply and reset the beam herself with a gin pole and tackle block, though it took until midnight and left her shoulders shaking from strain. Kincaid did not need to shout any longer. His influence worked through credit ledgers and social invitations, through who was greeted first on Main Street and whose account could wait until spring. One Thursday, with the temperature still 96 at dusk and dust thick enough to coat bread left uncovered, he stood at the store porch and addressed 6 men waiting on kerosene tins. "I do not fault grief," he said, voice smooth as oiled leather. "But grief is not engineering. She digs because digging gives shape to sorrow. The rest of us must live by results." No one contradicted him. Cole, who had come for lampwick and salt pork, set down $1 silver and took her wrapped bundle without requesting credit. As she stepped off the plank walk, Kincaid added, "When winter comes and that hole freezes empty, remember who warned you against widow weather sermons in place of proper works." She turned once, not to defend herself but to correct the premise. "Proper works are those that hold," she said. "Names do not hold anything." The remark moved through town faster than her water stake reports had ever moved. By early September, mockery had become organized exclusion, quiet but deliberate. A quilting circle changed meeting houses and forgot to send word. A council notice about communal well maintenance failed to reach her gate, though it reached every other claim on the North Bench. At the autumn trade day, where households usually swapped labor pledges before frost, her offer of 2 days crib carpentry in exchange for 1 day team hauling sat unanswered until sunset. She folded the paper and brought it home. The next morning, she cut her own haul road with cedar and a drag she built from fence rails. By the 3rd week of September, she had reached 21 feet and rebuilt the hoist line to reduce friction losses, threading rope through a second sheave mounted 2 feet above the first. So bucket travel stayed centered and did not scrape the shaft wall. The gain was practical. Fewer rope burns, fewer spills, steadier lifts in crosswind. She installed a brake cleat on the platform and marked descent intervals every 3 feet with wrapped twine knots so she could measure position by hand in poor light. The project now looked less like a hole and more like infrastructure. Even those who laughed could see that much. October came with clear mornings and hard evenings, and the valley entered the season Miriam had called truthful weather. Grass went brittle from the root up. Cottonwood leaves turned and dropped 2 weeks ahead of the year before. Cole walked section lines at dawn and watched where dew lingered longest. She traced old root paths, mapped frost heave along the basalt shoulder, and revised her dig line by inches to follow what she believed was a fractured seam trending west-southwest under her claim. The math was simple and unforgiving. A 1-degree error at 25 feet became a miss at 30. She cut a new plumb guide and checked it twice each day. By late October, she was at 24 feet 6 inches. The county hand pump still had not arrived, despite 2 additional notes posted at the store. The decorative church cistern stood half-finished, handsome stone with a carved lip and no dependable feed, while the north communal well dropped another foot and produced silt after noon draws. Cole did not mention the contrast. She extended cribbing, sealed seams, and set the 5th collar. Winter entered without ceremony in November, first as knives of wind through coat seams, then as mornings that froze bucket rims before breakfast. Digging slowed but did not stop. She rigged canvas skirts around the shaft mouth to block direct drafts and protect upper soil from sudden thaw-freeze cycles that caused sloughing. At 26 feet, she began using a rope seat for longer periods below, conserving leg strength for lift cycles. She kept a small brazier above ground to warm tools between rounds, so iron would not bite skin. Every technique cost time. Every technique saved time later. The town interpreted persistence as obsession. Kincaid found fresh words for it whenever audiences gathered. He called her shaft a monument to stubbornness before one council session, and a private tunnel to nowhere after another, each line polished to sound practical while doing social harm. The cruelty had texture now, not loud derision but refusals, omissions, and careful smiles that never opened into help. Cole answered with record-keeping and workmanship. Her ledger grew thick with dates, temperatures, depth marks, material costs, and observations of land behavior that few besides her believed mattered. In December, those observations sharpened. Jackrabbits began moving upslope before sunrise, not after, taking shelter in draws with north exposure where snow would linger longest when it came. Ant colonies rebuilt entrances into narrow towers, then sealed side vents with unusual haste. Meadowlarks migrated through in a compressed wave over 2 days instead of the usual 5, as though driven by pressure no human instrument in Sage Hollow could measure. Cole reported these signs to 2 neighbors while delivering split cedar kindling in trade. One thanked her and changed nothing. The other laughed, then repeated her warning at Kincaid's store as entertainment. January opened with a false gentleness that tempted confidence. On January 11th, the noon thermometer outside the schoolhouse read 58 degrees Fahrenheit, shirt-sleeve weather in a month that usually cracked pump handles. Children ran bareheaded. Men delayed firewood cutting for one more day of comfort. Cole did the opposite. She sealed every exposed seam at the shaft collar, doubled the brace wedges on the windward side, and moved spare rope into dry storage under canvas. She told Nell Harrow, who had come carrying slate and 2 stones for the basin wall, that warmth arriving too clean in deep winter was debt, not gift. By evening, the debt arrived. Temperature dropped 32 degrees in 5 hours, and ground that had softened by noon froze hard enough by dark to ring under boot heel. 2 shallow privy pits collapsed at their rims from rapid contraction. One outbuilding on the south road lost half its wall when poorly set posts heaved and snapped. At Kincaid's porch lamp, with men gathered close against the sudden cold, he lifted his hands and said the day proved nothing beyond frontier caprice, then added, to scattered agreement, that Porter's widow weather sermons had become a season of their own. Cole heard the remark the next morning while buying lamp oil and a pound of nails. She paid, tied the parcel to her belt, and rode home through wind that carried dust and frost in the same breath. At the shaft, she descended to 28 feet and found the lower wall stable, collar true, seam dry but cooler than surrounding stone. She marked it in the ledger, then worked until dark, rising only when the lantern flame thinned. By the first week of March, after a winter of measured blows and measured lifts, the shaft reached 31 feet with cribbing intact and 6 iron collars holding under tension. The town still called it Porter's Grave when it wanted to diminish what it did not understand. Cole kept reading grasses, insects, root lines, and frost fractures because the land continued to speak in sequence, and thirst remained late news. On March 9th, she tied off the hoist line, climbed from 31 feet of shadow into a wind that carried thaw and dust together, and stood long enough to watch where meltwater failed to linger. The north bench shed moisture too quickly, exactly as Miriam had warned such ground would do after a hard freeze in a dry winter. Cole marked 3 new frost fractures in her ledger, then walked the basalt shoulder and set 2 stakes along the line she believed the hidden seam would follow if she widened southwest instead of driving straight down. 3 days later, she began the lateral cut from the 31-foot level, working by lamplight below and daylight above, one arm of the shaft slowly turning toward darker gravel that stayed cool by touch. The method was slower and more dangerous than vertical digging, so she changed her sequence again. She set short crib panels every 2 feet, pinned by cross braces, then packed the back with clay and small stone to prevent side slough. At supper hour on March the 14th, the first damp grit appeared in her shovel. By dawn it had dried. She did not call it failure. She called it direction. By the final week of March, Sage Hollow had entered that deceptive interval when mud formed at noon, and iron froze to skin before dawn. The church cistern wall, handsome and useless through winter, now showed hairline cracks where poorly fired mortar had not endured repeated freeze and thaw. At the north communal well, 2 bucket loads out of 5 came up cloudy with suspended silt. Kincaid still held court from his porch, coat brushed, beard trimmed, ledger under one arm, yet the tone had shifted from amused certainty to brittle reassurance. He told whoever gathered that spring storms would refill every draw in 3 weeks. Even those who wished to believe him listened with their eyes on the ground. On April 2nd, a brief rain crossed the valley between mid-morning and noon, enough to darken topsoil and raise the smell of sage, not enough to soak beyond 2 inches. Children ran under it with pans and laughed, and for 6 hours the town behaved as if reprieve had arrived by right. By sunset the wind returned out of the southwest, warm and dry, and the shallow puddles vanished to salt rings. Cole took a sample from her stake trench with a hand trowel and found powder beneath the first crust. The next line in her ledger read, "Rain without depth is debt collected at dusk." She worked into April without spectacle. At 32 feet 6 inches, she widened the side channel another 18 inches and reached a band of rounded gravel mixed with black sand. At 33 feet 4 inches, seep began as a dark thread along a basalt contact, then halted when she overcut by half a shovel width and released pressure too quickly. She shored, waited, and resumed with smaller bites, carving a settling shelf below the seam so flow could gather rather than scatter. On April 19th, near noon, water cleared from cloudy to transparent and rose in the channel by the depth of 2 fingers. By midnight, it held steady enough for bucket filling at measured intervals. She did not announce triumph. She built order. Over the next 6 days, she laid a stone catch basin uphill from the shaft mouth, 10 feet long, 6 wide, with a graded floor of tamped gravel and lime clay joints. She carved fill lines on 3 barrel sets by household count, then drafted a rotation board with dawn, midday, and dusk draws. Each slot tied to labor days contributed to maintenance. Nell Harrow hauled rock. 2 Harrow boys carried sand. A widower from the South Road brought cedar posts and asked no public credit. The spring yielded near 11 gallons each minute once the channel settled, enough to keep 3 homesteads secure and more alive, if every draw respected arithmetic. Asa Kincaid came on April 27th in a clean coat, despite the heat, dismounted by the new basin, and offered $75 cash for easement control and distribution rights through his store, speaking as if he were proposing efficiency rather than ownership. "Water handled through one ledger prevents argument," he said. "I can set fair shares and preserve order." Cole stood beside the barrel lines with mud to her elbows and answered without raising her voice. "Order will be kept by work and measure. Bring stone, carry water, keep time, and draw. Coin will not stand watch at midnight." He stared at her for a long moment, then mounted and rode back towards town, with the posture of a man unused to refusal that did not ask his permission to continue. By May 3rd, the true catastrophe began, not as thunder or flood, but as absence sustained past endurance. Daytime highs crossed 101 degrees Fahrenheit and remained there. Night brought little relief, only gusting wind that stripped topsoil into moving veils and drove grit through door seams and eyelids. In 14 days, 6 private wells failed outright. In 21, all but Cole's spring shaft and 1 trickle at the far west, claim had gone dry enough to expose bucket scars on the stone. The town's plans failed in sequence. The decorative cistern, never properly fed, stood empty and split along its carved lip. The south communal well rope snapped twice because households pulled too fast on too little return, and on the second break the bucket cracked against exposed rock and had to be abandoned below. A freight wagon from Laramie arrived on May 18th with half the ordered barrels and no pump assembly. 1 mule went lame at the river crossing and was cut loose before town. At the depot platform, men argued over manifests while women held empty pails in shade that moved faster than patience. Kincaid's store, once a theater of abundance in a hard country, changed by the day into proof of miscalculation. The backroom barrels went first, then the kegs, then every tin vessel fit for transport. Shelves that had carried rope, flour, lamp oil, and confidence showed bare boards by the 3rd week of May. He attempted ration sales at escalating prices for 2 days, then stopped when there was little left to sell and no water to move. His 2 hired wagons stood behind the store with split casks staved by heat. Dust gathered on the polished boots he had once kept immaculate. On May 22nd, Thomas Reed collapsed beside the north pump after hauling 3 empty runs in one afternoon for his sister's household. He had been broad-backed all his life, a teamster who could lift an axle alone, and when he fell he still had the rope wrapped around one hand, as if effort might continue by habit. Neighbors carried him to his porch, cooled his neck with the last wet cloth in the house, and sent for aid that could not reverse 2 days of depletion. He died after dark with his boots still on because no one wished to waste water washing him for burial. 4 days later, near dusk, Ruth Vale died in her mother Eliza's arms on the road from Cottonwood Draw. Ruthie had turned 22 that spring and had insisted on taking the lighter barrel while her mother managed the mule line. They found only trickle at the draw, then spent 2 hours under burning wind coaxing a half fill from pooled shadow under stone. The return took too long. By the time they reached the ridge above town, Ruth could no longer stand. Eliza sat with her against the wagon wheel, holding a cup with 1 inch of warm water she tried to pour slowly, and called her daughter by her childhood name until the light went out of the valley, and then out of Ruth as well. On May 29th, Father Gideon Pike gave away his last canteen outside the church to a pair of farmhands who had walked in from the east ditch with cracked lips and unsteady gait. He was an old man with narrow shoulders and a voice that had baptized half the settlement, and he waved off help when told to sit in the shade, saying others needed what he had more. They found him at twilight on the church steps, hat folded under his arm, one hand resting on the rail as if pausing between duties. He did not survive the night. Bells did not ring for him in the morning because there was no strength left in town for ceremony. By the first day of June, despair had become procedural. Households lined up before sunrise at any rumor of moisture. Men who had mocked measurements now argued over cup marks. Women rationed by spoon and counted swallows aloud, so children would accept limits as fairness. Animals fell quiet in their pens. The valley itself seemed to retreat from sound. At dawn on June 2nd, Nell Harrow came to Cole's Gate at a run, braid loose, throat raw from dust, carrying 2 ledgers pressed against her chest to keep them clean. She had been sent by the schoolteacher to ask for immediate draws for 5 homes, with no standing capacity left. Cole took 1 ledger, scanned names, and asked 3 questions only: barrel count, walking distance, and who in each household could lift. She then handed Nell a chalk stub and pointed to the basin wall. "Mark 3 lines on every vessel that arrives," she said. "Top line for boiling, middle for drinking, bottom for animals and wash. No one crosses a line without my word. Children drink first at each round. Return with whoever can carry stone." Nell nodded once and ran back toward town, calling names before she reached the road bend. The request widened within hours from 5 homes to nearly all of Sage Hollow. Near noon, Asa Kincaid walked through Cole's Gate carrying his own iron bucket, coat off, shirt dark with sweat, beard untrimmed, eyes fixed not on her face but on the basin-level marks he had once dismissed as widow arithmetic. Behind him came ranch hands, seamstresses, laborers, and 2 councilmen, each with containers that no longer signaled rank. Cole did not pause to adjudicate memory. She assigned stations, 1 line for filling, 1 for carrying, 1 for return and cleaning. She set Cedar to a relay sledge hauling sealed casks to 3 outlying claims where travel time would otherwise consume half a day of strength. She appointed Nell to entry marks and old Mavis Pike, sister to Gideon, to cup distribution under the shade awning. Every draw was logged by household and hour. Every vessel was inspected for cracks before refill. Every argument was cut short by arithmetic. When one ranch foreman protested his reduced share, she pointed to the ledger and to the line of children waiting with tin mugs. "Need is counted by thirst and number," she said, "not by acreage." He stepped back without another word. Through that first emergency week, she slept in intervals of less than an hour on a pallet beside the basin wall, waking at each watch change to verify levels and adjust flow. She taught while she rationed, how to shade barrels with wet canvas to reduce loss, how to seal staves with flour paste when proper pitch failed, how to station carriers by distance so no soul spent strength walking unnecessary miles. Kincaid took a turn on night watch at her direction and entered figures exactly as she required. Each line neat, each amount witnessed. On June 7th, with the heat still above 100 at midday and wind sharp as ground glass, the yard at Cole's claim had become what the town had refused to build in easier seasons. A measured water station governed by labor, sequence, and restraint. No speech marked the change. The change was visible in surviving faces and in the steady rise and fall of buckets moving on time. By that same evening, Cole had added one more line to the chalkboard at the basin: shade before speed. She sent boys with hammer and scrap plank to raise a lean awning over the waiting line, had older girls soak canvas in wash water and drape it over barrel tops, and ordered every household to bring whatever dried beans, cornmeal, or salt pork they still possessed to a common cook fire, so that no family spent precious water on 5 separate pots. Her root cellar, dug shallow 2 winters earlier for turnips and onions, became a cool room for medicines and cloth wraps. The smokehouse Daniel had framed before his fever took him became a ration room where Nell Harrow measured oats into sacks by cup and tied each with twine marked for household count. Cole opened every reserve she had kept. She did not ask who had mocked. She asked who could carry, who could boil, who could watch through the night. 3 days passed before the first territorial relief wagon reached Sage Hollow from the East Road, wheels banded in dust, barrels half full, driver hollow-eyed from heat and delay. By then, Cole had already trained 27 souls in rotation protocol, assigned 8 to sanitation, and taught 6 men to read seep rate by timing bucket rise against notch marks cut into the shaft lining. The expensive availures of spring sat in plain sight around them. The church cistern with its decorative lips split and dry, the snapped ropes at communal wells, the absent county pump assembly that had been promised twice and delivered never. Against those failures stood her patched shovel, 6 iron collars, pine cribbing set by hand, and a ledger whose pages had no ornament, only dates, measures, and the discipline that had kept children alive through June. Relief did not end crisis at once. It reduced panic first, then thirst. Cole insisted that outside barrels be treated as supplement, not salvation, and she was obeyed because the arithmetic had become undeniable. At dawn, she continued teaching on the basin edge, placing stones in rows to represent households and moving them to show how one undisciplined draw at noon stole from 3 homes at dusk. She made men who had spent their lives on horses practice carrying 2 full pails without spill, because wasted ounces had become a moral question. She showed women how to sink clay-lined cooling pits on the north side of houses to preserve a day's draw from sun loss. She showed children where not to step near shaft collar braces, and why. Knowledge traveled faster than rumor now, because rumor had buried enough souls. By June 24th, the second relief train arrived with spare staves, flour, and the hand pump assembly that had missed loading months before. The crate sat on Kincaid's porch like an indictment, stenciled with a dispatch date from April. No one cheered when it was pried open. They carried the parts to Cole's yard and laid them beside the basin until she examined each thread and valve. 2 pieces were flawed from transit damage. She marked them with charcoal and set them aside for repair, rather than trust them in a critical installation. That evening, as red light thinned over the north bench, she assigned work crews for the next phase, 1 to maintain Porter spring draws, 1 to rehabilitate the north communal well with proper lining, 1 to strip the church cistern wall for reusable stone. The town had wanted rescue to feel like deliverance. Cole made it feel like labor, because labor endured. In the first week of July, when daytime highs finally dropped below 90 by late afternoon, the reckoning began in the manner most consistent with Sage Hollow's pride, not with speeches but with hands arriving at her gate carrying tools. A ranch hand who had laughed at Porter's grave came with quarried blocks on a sled and stacked them without asking payment. Two women from the quilting circle brought back the pails they had borrowed in May, each rim repaired and handle re-riveted. The schoolteacher who had once repeated Kincaid's weather remark returned Cole's notes on route lines, copied in neat script, and asked if she might teach them to older students as practical geography. Cole answered yes, then handed her a shovel and directed her to the drainage trench. Shame in that valley moved first through work. As July deepened, individual apologies emerged, hesitant and unscripted. Mavis Pike stood at the basin after a dusk draw and said, with her brother newly buried on the rise, that she had mistaken silence for hardness and hard labor for stubborn vanity. Cole listened and gave her extra lamp oil for the walk home. Eliza Vale came one morning with Ruth's shawl folded over her arms and asked that it be cut into shade cloth for children in the queue. She did not ask forgiveness for any words she had spoken, because grief had made those words irrelevant. She asked where to tie the cloth so it would hold in wind. Cole tied one corner and had Eliza tie the other. The action answered more than language could. Asa Kincaid came last among those who came plainly. On July 19th, after morning draws and before the noon ration bell, he crossed Cole's yard carrying a ledger under one arm and a length of new hemp rope under the other. He had lost weight through the drought, and the polish had gone from his boots in a way no brush could restore. He stood beside the stone lip and waited until the line shortened. "I called this work Porter's Grave," he said, voice level, not pitched for audience. "I called your readings Widow Weather Sermons. I tripled rope prices while your hands were splitting on Kalishi. I did these things in public. I asked to answer for them in public also." Cole looked at the rope, then at the ledger he held. "If you wish to answer in public, then bring figures, not posture. Bring what you charged in May and what it should have been. Bring what you can return and what you cannot." He nodded once. "I will." The council called a town meeting for July 23rd in the church, whose cracked cistern wall had been partly dismantled that week, stone by stone. Attendance counted 287 souls, with others absent on hall duty to outlying claims. Windows stood open to evening wind. The 3 fresh graves lay visible from the south doorway beyond the cottonwoods. No one mistook the purpose of the gathering. Kincaid spoke first because he had asked to. He did not stand at the pulpit. He stood on the floor among benches. He read from his own account book in a voice stripped of his old flourish, naming item by item the drought prices he had set, the margin each represented over spring rates, and the households that had paid. He named the phrase Porter's Grave and repeated it as evidence against himself, not as jest. He described his offer to buy control of the spring for $75 and stated before all present that he had attempted ownership where stewardship was required. Then, he set a canvas pouch on the front bench containing coin and signed notes equal to the overcharges he could immediately repay, with the balance to be worked off by selling pump parts at cost until the debt was exhausted. When he finished, there was no applause. The quiet had weight. Others followed, not in a formal line, but as courage moved them. The ranch foreman, who had argued acreage over thirst, admitted that he had treated water as entitlement and had watched children wait while he protested. 2 councilmen acknowledged voting for carved stone over reinforced wells because visible prestige had seemed easier to defend than unseen precaution. The school teacher said she had allowed mockery to become lesson among children and had failed her duty long before the drought arrived. Each confession named specific words spoken, specific acts omitted, and specific harm done. The pattern mattered. General regret would have lightened no burden. Near the close of the meeting, Nell Harrow was asked to read from the emergency draw ledger she had kept at Cole's side during the worst week. Her voice shook only on the first lines, then steadied. She read dates, household counts, gallons issued, and notes beside names where children had been given additional cups under heat watch. She read Thomas Reed, draw ceased May 22nd. She read Ruth Vale, draw reassigned to Eliza Vale household, May 26th. She read Father Gideon Pike, final canteen transfer noted May 29th. Data in that room became memorial, and memorial became instruction. Only after the others had spoken did Cole stand. She remained beside her bench, hat in her hands, not seeking height. "Apology is not water," she said. "It does not revive Thomas Reed, Ruth Vale, or Gideon Pike. It does not return Daniel Porter. Therefore, I will not spend this night pretending that words settle graves. But words can mark direction, and direction can still save those living. If this town wishes to reckon honestly, then reckon in maintenance days before heat, in shared stores before panic, in well linings inspected in March rather than mourned in June." She let the room absorb that and continued, voice even. "I did not dig to be proven right. I dug because thirst was coming, and no one else was counting depth. I will teach any household that asks how to read slope, root, frost fracture, ant tower, and grass color. I will teach at dawn on Saturdays until frost. In return, each household will send one worker to spring maintenance each month, and each council vote touching water will include measured capacity, not merely cost. If you call that forgiveness, that is your language. I call it terms for survival." No one challenged the terms. The vote to adopt them was unanimous, entered in council minutes before lanterns were extinguished. By the second week of August, crews had lined the north communal well with proper cribbing and fitted repaired pump parts under Cole's supervision. By September, 2 additional community wells were under construction on the east and south roads, each sited by slope and route mapping rather than convenience. Kincaid kept his promise with visible discipline. Pump washers, rope, hooks, and barrel hoops sold at documented cost, with each receipt marked against his restitution ledger until the final overcharge was balanced. The phrase, "build it like Porter," began as worksite shorthand, then settled into instruction used without irony by men who had once laughed from saddles. Years passed, and the memory did not fade into myth because Sage Hollow recorded it in procedures, not merely in stories. In 1890, the town population reached 349 souls, and the Water Committee, created after the drought, published seasonal inspection dates on the church door each February. In 1893, after a severe cold winter, the wells held because linings were checked before freeze and vent caps were repaired on schedule. In 1898, when a dry spell returned, rationing began in April by plan rather than in May by fear. Children in the schoolyard learned to identify cottonwood root spread and ant mound height as part of practical lessons, with Nell Harrow, grown and appointed teacher, requiring field notebooks modeled on Cole's ledger pages. Cole aged with the work. Her shoulders remained broad, her palms remained scarred, and Daniel's gloves stayed at her belt on every inspection round. She took no office, accepted no title beyond what neighbors chose to speak, and continued dawn checks at Porter Spring until her hair had silvered, and younger crews could carry full responsibility without supervision. Cedar, old and slow by then, died in late autumn of 1901 and was buried above the basin under a stone marked only with her name. Cole attended the burial, then returned to check seep rate before supper. As decades turned, the original shaft was enclosed with a low stone wall and timber cover to protect it from debris, but the first basin remained in use for emergency draws. The carved line on its lip, cut by Kincaid's own hand in repayment years after the meeting, stayed legible through wind and sun. Depth is mercy stored in advance. Travelers copied the phrase into notebooks. Children recited it before spring maintenance days. No one in Sage Hollow remembered Porter's grave as mockery any longer. The words survived only in ledgers and testimonies as a caution about what arrogance costs when weather turns. The Porter Spring Cooperative still keeps household drawbooks in a cabinet of dry pine in the old pump house. The entries continue in ink, date by date, season by season, with notes on repairs, seep rates, and labor shares. The stone lip still bears that carved line. The water still rises cold from below the basalt seam. And in Sage Hollow, where 312 souls once trusted luck more than preparation, wisdom is now measured the way Cole taught them to measure everything that matters, in depth taken before the thirst arrives. On the first maintenance Saturday after that lesson had been entered in the cooperative book, the pump house yard filled before sunrise with 38 souls carrying shovels, braces, rope coils, and empty coffee tins for bolt storage, and Cole stood by the basin wall with Daniel's gloves at her belt and assigned each task by name, distance, and strength, as if dispatching a harvest crew before a storm. She sent 2 teams to scrape the east drainage trench, one to repack clay seals at the shaft collar, one to inspect every barrel hoop for hairline splits, and one to the church lot where the last decorative stones were still stacked in a neat pile, waiting to become useful at last. Kincaid arrived with a mule cart of iron and timber, and for the first time in town memory, no ledger tucked under his arm for profit. In the cart lay the 2 damaged pump pieces from the June crate, the same pieces Cole had marked in charcoal and refused to trust in a critical line. He had taken them to the blacksmith in Elk Crossing, paid for brazing and thread recutting, and returned with a county receipt folded in oilcloth. The county clerk, embarrassed by the April dispatch failure that had cost lives, had sent $38 in reimbursement for delayed equipment and one written acknowledgement that the shipment had missed loading through administrative neglect, not weather. Kincaid handed both to the cooperative treasurer in open view, then carried the repaired valves to Cole for inspection without saying a word. She turned each piece in her hands, checked thread pitch with a gauge Daniel had once filed himself, ran a cloth through the interior to test for metal burrs, and nodded only when both passed. "Install one at North Well by noon," she said. "Store the spare in dry pine with grease wrap. Mark the cabinet shelf with date and repair source." Nell Harrow, now old enough to keep formal records for both school and water committee, wrote every instruction in a firm hand and asked who would sign the storage line. Kincaid stepped forward first, then Mavis Pike, then Cole. The cabinet entry was complete. By the middle of September 1888, the community had moved from emergency obedience to disciplined habit, and that shift showed most clearly in the way children now repeated measurements instead of taunts. At recess, they recited draw intervals and seep rates because Nell required practical notebooks, and when one boy said Porter's grave with the old smirk, 3 others corrected him before any adult spoke. Porter Spring, they said. Measure before draw. Language had turned. The private reckonings also continued, each one slower than the public meeting and in many ways harder. The ranch foreman who had demanded water by acreage came at dusk with his hat in both hands and 2 of his hired men behind him carrying quarried stone. He admitted that he had taught those men to laugh at Cole's ledger board in May, and had kept laughing even after Thomas Reed died. "I do not ask you to forget it," he said, standing beside the trough he now helped scrub every 3rd day. "I ask where to put my labor so that my sons do not carry my error." Cole pointed him to the west trench and told him to bring his sons on the next inspection round. He brought them. 3 days later, Eliza Vale returned with Ruth's shawl newly hemmed into 4 shade panels, each corner reinforced with hand-stitching so wind would not tear them loose at the first gust. She tied them herself above the children's line while Cole checked cup counts below. No speech was offered, none required. The cloth held through the next hot spell and through 2 seasons after. and each repair stitch remained visible as a kind of testimony. In October, when nights dropped below freezing and daytime still climbed into dry heat, Sage Hollow tested its new order under strain. One pump handle cracked at dawn on the South Road. The old system would have produced shouting and blame by noon. The new system produced a written notice at the church door by 7, a spare handle from cabinet inventory by 8, and full operation before the midday draw. Kincaid entered the replacement cost at wholesale, signed his restitution line, and refused markup, though no one would have challenged him. Cole checked the install bolts and returned to trench grading. That same week, she resolved the last personal account that had lingered, unnoticed by most, since the summer Daniel died. In the back of Kincaid's oldest ledger, under 1887 flour and lamp oil, sat the line, Porter, C., $8 due after harvest. Kincaid opened to that page in the store, laid it on the counter between them, and set down $8 silver from his own pocket. This debt stood while your husband lay in his grave, and while I profited from thirst, he said. I carried it because it favored me. It ends today. Cole pushed $4 back toward him. $4 for goods received, she said. $4 to the Thomas Reed and Ruth Vale Grave Fund for stone upkeep. He accepted the division, made the entries in fresh ink, and had Nell witness the page closure. The old balance no longer shadowed the new work. By April 1889, the committee had formalized what Cole had demanded in that church meeting: pre-crisis maintenance before any decorative spending. Each household sent one worker on first Saturday rounds, and absences required replacement labor within 7 days. Cole taught at dawn as promised, not from a pulpit but from ditch edge and shaft collar. She laid out route maps in dust with a stick, showed how ant towers had warned before the heat wave, how jackrabbit movement had shifted before dawn, how the January false warm spell had preceded hard freeze by hours, and how frost fractures in March had indicated where lateral widening should begin. Her method was always the same: observe, measure, record, build. By June, 3 new apprentices could cite a shallow test, bore within 10 feet of her own chosen points. The cooperative also accounted for every object that had carried the town through crisis. The patched shovel, its wagon tire strap still riveted and worn smooth by 9 months of caliche, was cleaned, oiled, and hung on the pump house wall with a carved tag listing dates of use. Daniel's plum stone remained in service each spring, then returned to a padded drawer after inspections. The emergency chalkboard, scrubbed but never repainted, stayed mounted above the basin with old fill lines, still faint beneath new marks. Nothing was discarded simply because prosperity had returned. Years later, when another dry season pressed hard in 1898, relief wagons were requested in April through proper channels and arrived to supplement, not rescue. The county's second report, this time timely, credited Sage Hollow with the most complete household draw records in the district and used its rotation ledger as model language for 2 neighboring settlements. Nell read that report aloud at the schoolhouse and then handed copies to students who filed them beside weather logs and route sketches. Practical memory had become civic practice. Cole did not soften into sentiment with age, but she did widen into trust. She turned more teaching hours over to Nell and to 2 farm sons who had once hauled stone in silence at 13. She accepted help carrying iron collars when her wrists stiffened in winter. She kept Daniel's gloves at her belt until the seams failed, then set them in the cabinet beside Miriam Porter's rap notes from Tennessee Hill Country, both tagged as instruction sources rather than relics. On the morning she finally stopped climbing the shaft ladder herself, she stood at the lip, timed 1 full bucket cycle by watch, and corrected a young man's knot with 2 quick motions. Speed is nothing without return, she said. The lesson held. When she died in late autumn of 1906, after a short fever that no watercraft could prevent, the town did not call her savior and did not call her saint. They called roll at the pump house at dawn, assigned draw duty as usual, then carried her to the rise above the basin where Cedar and Daniel already lay, and each household sent one representative with a stone taken from the old church cistern wall. They built a low ring around her grave before sunset and left one opening facing the spring. At the next first Saturday maintenance, Nell opened the cabinet, took out the cooperative book, and read the carved line from the basin lip before any tools were lifted. Children repeated it. Adults repeated it. Then they worked the full day, trench by trench, bolt by bolt, seal by seal, until the entries were complete and signed by every crew lead. Sage Hollow had learned what Cole had tried to teach when no one wished to hear it. Mercy was rarely dramatic, almost never accidental, and always built in advance by hands willing to labor before fear made labor fashionable.